And welcome. This is, we did this last year. This is the second time we've done this. It was exciting the first year. It's been exciting again the second year. It's always amazing how many people actually sort of have to make this happen. Not only just all of you coming in this room today, but to get all the things on the tables and the food here, and it's incredible. And I like it. So I'm Jody Platt. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Learning Health Sciences, and I've been working with many of the people in this room to make this event happen. And I'm just going to start off with a few remarks about why we're here today and what are we going to do today. And then Kate Spector-Baghdadi will sort of continue sort of framing the day, and then we have a lineup of really marvelous speakers to talk about the ethical, legal, and social implications of data sharing and knowledge sharing in a learning health system. So we're here because, we all know this, healthcare is changing. It always has been and always will continue to be. But healthcare is moving into the digital age. So we've gone from paper records to electronic records. We've gone from a world where, and we still have a world where we have a fax-based system, and hopefully we're going to update that to something that looks a little bit more interoperable and exchangeable of health information. But we also are increasingly seeing the capacity to share knowledge that's in computable form. And the ideal here is that that's in the context of a learning health system. So we're not just sharing knowledge or spitting it out in the world, but we're actually learning from the knowledge and creating new knowledge after that. Up until now, we've had data that's generated because we have done some work that generates data. So we go to the clinic, and there's data that's generated from that. We do research that generates data. We do public health, and that generates data. And now with today, and increasingly, we can reverse that process as well. So we have the data in this sort of cyclical process in, again, this sort of learning health system model. And anybody who's sort of spent much time here at Michigan has seen this loop a lot. And it's interesting, it's evolved over time, but this is basically it. So the idea is that we have data, we put it together, we learn something from it, we interpret it, we put it into practice, and the practice we learn from that, and it's sort of a continuous cycle of continuous improvement. And at every step along this way, there are sort of ethical, legal, and social implications and questions. And again, that's why we're here. There are a number of ethical frameworks that we can use to sort of ask ourselves about what the ethical questions are in the learning cycle. There is one that's sort of the dominant one at the moment that was published several years ago now. But the idea here is that we can put together the ethical frameworks in clinical care with the ethical frameworks in research and come up with something new. So what I'm going to sort of put forward also today is that there are other frameworks at play. So there are ethical frameworks not only on clinical care and research, but public health has a set of ethical frameworks. And we're looking at new technology. So there's ethics related to invention and technology. And if you talk to people who are building the learning health system, they'll often use this latter framework for the underlying principles of the learning health system, that data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that sort of interestingly plays out to the acronym FAIR. So they're looking at fairness, but in a very different way than a clinical ethicist might think about fairness. There's a similar sort of wild interplay of regulatory frames that we're also going to be looking at, right? So clinical care has one set of rules, research has a different set of rules. When you're doing both at the same time, which ones do you follow? And I'm not going to answer that, but we have people here that can weigh in on it. Several of you responded to this sort of 37-second request to find out why you're here. And I'm not going to get into the details of those, but there were some really lovely responses. I'd say last year, most of what we heard, we had a similar request. What I heard was, we want to learn what the learning health system is. And this year, the question was not what is the learning health system, but things like, how do we understand the ethical and implications of our work globally, locally, and across the country? And so there's sort of an evolution of sort of, okay, we have a sense of the learning health system, but what are the ethical implications, and how can I really put that into practice? And I think we're going to hear today a lot of sort of really practical advice around how to make this happen. A lot of you are here because we have a fabulous lineup of speakers, and we do. And I'll say that we've had a bit of an adventure in the last week in terms of some people who are very critically ill who can't be here today, and some really lovely people and smart and amazing, and still a great program of people that can step in and sort of make this still a really fabulous program. So I want to thank them, thank the planning committee, thank our committee of people that were flexible to that. I mean, the fact that our agenda is up to date on the website is a testimony to the fact that we're a good team. Mary Wines, who's outside and sort of greeted you coming in, is responsible for all of the logistics today. Yay. You can, anyway. She's smiling. Yeah. And Teva Platt, who designed this stuff. The gears, the logos, the buttons, the communications is really sort of Teva did that. And I could do this all day, but we have anyway, great. You're also here to network, and we've built time into the program to do that, and I hope that you take advantage of that. You'll see on your tables the speakers are sort of up here, so they're local to the podium during the day, but will sort of be available to talk to you and get to know you. But you also have great people sitting at your table, so that's exciting. And then a lot of you are here just for general knowledge still, but to think about how to think about the ethical, legal, and social aspects of learning health systems, how to account for values in policy and government, and governance, informed consent, and then to understand the methods for how we can sort of go about sort of answer these questions and inquire these questions methodologically, systematically, and in ways that research can sort of generate knowledge, which is exciting. So we have an empirical basis for what we're doing. We've designed the program, we've cut it into sort of 3 main sessions: systems, equity, and choice, and they'll get to each of those sort of question areas. And then we have a poster session afterwards with a reception and a little happy hour, so to sort of continue the networking and some sort of interesting general knowledge. I had some great conversations with people who were submitting abstracts. They're like, should I do this? Should I not do this? It's like, do it. I mean, the idea is that they're posters and they're conversation starters. So I think people are excited to talk about the things that they're thinking about in this space. It's new to me, it's new to all of us. So with that, Ray sort of kicked us off last year with the notion that this was a moment to start the conversation, and I would say that this year is the moment to keep the conversation going. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kate Spector-Baghdadi.
Thanks, Jody. So in light of keeping the conversation going that started last year, I did want to go over a little bit of the good work that was presented at our symposium last year. So last year we just sort of tried to cut a broad swath of what does ELSI LHS mean to you? So we invited all sorts of speakers that spoke on all sorts of topics, and we kind of tried to cluster them. They didn't necessarily stay clustered. But I think by the end of the session, we really came out with sort of 3 main themes that resonated. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of speakers' presentations, although all of them were excellent and all of them are available on the website. So one of the first themes was a tension between research and clinical care that Jody already alluded to. The fact that our governance systems are very much set up to regulate and govern by the way that data and specimens enter into the system, and the tensions that that creates once we start mixing these things together post hoc. So for example, Dr. John Lantos talked about this sort of overriding presumption that clinicians are always acting in the best interest of the patient, and that must be what is in the best interest of the patient, whereas researchers are there to create generalizable knowledge. And those 2 things cannot overlap. And, you know, should we be talking about risks of research as that which is over the standard of care? Or should we assume that the standard of care is always that which is best for the patient? These kinds of complicated issues. Dr. David Magnus talked about some of the research on medical practice that they do, where they compare attitudes of IRB reviewers with patients and find that there's a lot of difference often between what IRB reviewers think patients are worried about and what patients actually are worried about. And Dr. Todd Rice of Vanderbilt gave the example of the work that they do in their ICU on learning health system and randomizing their own patients within a standard of care. And it's a method of sort of opt out, sort of the academic medical school model. If you come to the University of Michigan, students are going to be involved, and they sort of approach their learning health system that way. A second big theme was sort of the critical importance of community engagement. And with us to talk about that, in addition to others, were Ken Key and Yvonne Lewis of the Healthy Flint Research Coordinating Center. And they talked to us a little bit about this continuum of community engagement. You don't either have community engagement or you don't. There's really a continuum of engagement that we should be striving to achieve. And on sort of the lesser end is sort of this academically driven but community-placed kind of community research, where, as for example, I would say, well, I'm an OBGYN, so I want to do research on how the lead in the water affected the miscarriage rate in Flint. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to ask people to consent to be part of my research. But on the other end of the spectrum is a community-partnered or community-based participatory research, where people are really engaged. So instead of me saying, this is what I want to do, will you consent to my research, I would go in and I say, what are your priorities? What are we trying to achieve? What are your goals? What can I do to help you achieve those goals, and how can we work together? So they really laid that forth for us very clearly. And then a third theme, which particularly resonated with me, is sort of the importance of not building bias into our systems. I think often we assume that systems and algorithms are neutral. And they're not. And they're not neutral because we are not neutral. And we build our own biases into these systems. And then the systems reflect our biases. And then we can say, oh, gee, see, it's neutral. And we like whitewash our biases through algorithms. So one of the people who came to talk to us about that was Dr. Patricia Kingori of Oxford. And she told this really lovely story that maybe some of you have already heard, but about how we actually build bias into architecture. And so this is a famous bridge that was built between Long Island and Jones Beach, and many believe that it was intentionally created too low for buses to pass under. So buses can't go under, only cars. And many believe that the intent of that was so that the African American population of Long Island, who mostly used the public transit system, could not access Jones Beach, because you could only access it via car. So not only is that an access issue, but it's also a health issue. When you think of the recreation and the swimming and sort of the public engagement prospects of being able to access this. And this resonates across many things that we design. For example, this park bench was obviously designed to prohibit people from sleeping on it. However, it also prohibits many other kinds of people from sitting on it. If someone was overweight, if someone was pregnant, you know, I don't know that I could fit on that park bench. So what does that mean for people who are trying to go out and exercise and take a moment and take a break? And then things like putting gates around neighborhood parks and keeping people out. And she gave an example of diabetes research. And if researchers are looking at, you know, single-parent households, income, and value of homeownership, they might think that, they might say, oh, the conclusion is that diabetes is associated with being raised in a single-parent household and low income. But what they're not asking are, you know, are there food deserts? Is there access to park and recreation? You know, is there gym time at the local schools? And so the way we design our research gives us the answers that we might be biased to seek. And then, of course, Vince Bonham of NHGRI, personal hero of mine, talked about bias in genetic biobanking and data banking, and sort of the promise of the learning health system to try to eradicate that. And he specifically referenced this Nature publication that shows what these architectural biases look like when they're ingrained into our health data. And so this is an example of sort of the overall diversity increasing over the years. However, still remaining at 4%. Much of that difference is in people of Asian ancestry, and there's still a huge gap between people of African ancestry and indigenous ancestries. And what that means not only for the data going in, but the data we're able to apply that's coming out, who we can help, and what communities we can help access the kinds of achievements we're making. So just very briefly, because nobody cares about this, but like me and Nicholson and a couple of other lawyers, oh, Lizzie, yep, thank you. But the laws are very conflicted around this, as we saw in our first theme. For example, biospecimens, if you go into the clinic and you donate or you leave your biospecimens, the courts have generally said it's not yours, it's abandoned, it's donated, you don't have an interest in it unless it's identified. Also, on the research side, long story short, there was 6 years of debate on how to update the human subjects research regulations and whether we should consider all human biospecimens inherently identifiable, yada, yada, yada. 6 years later, we have basically the same definition, except for now we have to disclose that we might de-identify. And then we've done a lot of really good work at the University of Michigan and elsewhere, and just really quickly, work from Dr. Reshma Jaxi, who's the director of our Center for Bioethics, and from Dr. DeVries, who's also here, who's going to talk later, and also from Dr. Platt and Dr. Cardia. But we know that people care. And we know that people care that their biospecimens and their data are going in. We know that they care what they're being used for. And we know that really trust is the integral component of all of this. So what that means for us today is that we really have our work cut out for us. And so you'll see that in front of you, you all have gears and you have colored pens, which will hopefully inspire you. We on the committee were like, oh, they have to be colored pens. That's really exciting. So what we're going to ask you to do is actually, as people talk, and we would like you to sort of brainstorm and be engaged on these gears and put down the ideas that you're having either in the categories or not. And we're going to collect those all at the end, and they're going to help us inform our conference planning going forward, and also research. And we're happy to reach back out to you after the conference with some of the things that we learned from the gears that you fill out. And also, we have a rather generous 30-minute break between the first panel and the next. And the reason is not for you guys to go to the bathroom and primp for 30 minutes. You guys all look gorgeous already. The point is that we want you guys to have some time to network, to fill out the gears, because there's, it's a short conference. We want people to sort of be rotating and generating as we go. So with that, I would like to call up our first panel on systems. Thank you.
Good morning, and welcome to the first panel. I am Nicholson Price. I'm an assistant professor at the law school, and I focus on the way that law shapes innovation in the life sciences with a focus on big data and machine learning and health. So this is right up my alley. I'm excited to hear everybody speak today. So we're focusing first on systems. Obviously, it's one of the most integral components of learning from health. We need people, but without the systems, what can anybody do? We can't collect, we can't analyze, we can't store, we can't translate the data that are involved in actually learning from health. But the systems, of course, are not just passive repositories of information. They themselves are active and evolving and have their own implications for the ethics, law, and social concerns relating to a learning health system. So today we've got a panel of speakers on the cutting edge of this work, setting policy for best practices from the individual researcher up to the level of the entire privacy system. So our first speaker, Dr. Kimberlyn McGrail, focuses on quantitative policy evaluation, aging, and the use and cost of healthcare services, as well as the ethical and technical aspects of the development and operation of large linked data systems. She is an associate professor at the University of British Columbia in the School of Population and Public Health and the Center for Health Services and Policy Research. She is also scientific director of Population Health BC and data director for the new BC Academic Health Sciences Network. She's a founding member of the International Population Data Linkage Network and founding deputy editor of the International Journal of Population Data Science. Joining us One further down is Elizabeth Pike, a leading expert in the intersection of law, privacy, and health and genetic data. She is currently the Director of Privacy Policy in the Office of the Chief Information Officer at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she oversees privacy policy for the agency. Prior to that, she was a senior policy and research analyst with President Obama's Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, as well as a fellow at the National Institute of Health's Department of Bioethics. Her work has been published in the Georgetown Law Journal and the Cardozo Law Review, among others. Joining us for the discussion portion of the evening, one further down, is the University of Michigan's own Karen Calhoun, who uses community engagement, collaboration, and partnerships with diverse stakeholders to solve community-based problems. She is a Community Engaged Research Program Officer with the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research and a community partner with City Connect Detroit. She has expertise developing and implementing community-based participatory research efforts and facilitating community academic health partnerships. Previously, she served as an associate director with Progress in Community Health Partnerships, local project director for the first national CBPR clinical trials project, and coordinator for the Kresge Foundation's first social programming grant-making effort. Finally, Dr. Warren Kibbe is a recognized national leader in biomedical informatics and data sharing. He is the Chief for Translational Biomedical Informatics in the Department of Biostatistics and Bioinformatics and Chief Data Officer for the Duke Cancer Institute. Previously, he was the acting Deputy Director of the National Cancer Institute and Director of its Center for Biomedical Informatics and Information Technology. In 2017, Dr. Kibbe was recognized by FedHealth IT as one of the top 100 executives and leaders in federal healthcare IT, and most recently he played a pivotal role in coordinating the data sharing scientific components of the Cancer Moonshot Initiative. After the three presentations, we'll all come together for discussion with Karen Calhoun leading us off. So please hold your questions until the end, although of course, if you have special thoughts, please do write them down on the gears. Dr. McGrail, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just going to say it's going to be a miracle if I don't fall off the back of this during this, so pray for me. Thank you so much for the invitation to fill in. I'm sorry for anybody who thought they were getting Peter Emby. I'm sure I am a very sad substitute for him, but I'll do my best to bring something to this session this morning. Just before I get underway, I just want to acknowledge all my colleagues and others who have talked with me about the things I'm going to be talking about today and listened to previous presentations on similar subjects, because that's all helped form what you're going to hear. So in the time that I have, I want to talk about a few different things, and I feel like I've really been set up well by what Kate and Jody have already said. So one of the things we just want to establish is what's different about learning health systems. Why do we want to think about ethics and data sharing in a maybe a slightly different way than we have before? But on top of what's happening in the learning health system itself, what are the other things that are changing, or what else is happening that we ought to bring into consideration for thinking through ethical implications? How do we balance risks and rewards is really one of the fundamental things we come down to. If we think of an ethical lens on things, it really is about trying to establish what risk is worth tolerating given the public benefit that could come out of use of data. And then some thoughts on possible way, and really should be ways forward. Okay, so one of the first things that we know, and this is to me the big thing about learning health systems from a data perspective, is that there's just a lot more analytics going on. So the idea of learning health systems is that we're constantly collecting data through the process of delivering care and using that data to make sure that we're improving the quality of service provision and ideally, of course, ultimately outcomes of patients. And Jody already mentioned this, one of the foundational papers in my view for this is this kind of proposal for a new ethical framework. And it really does say that I mean, my interpretation, it's got 7 different considerations in there, but really what this comes down to is if we're talking about a learning health system, then every service event is a learning opportunity, and so this false distinction that we create between clinical care and research actually gets in the way of doing what we need to be doing. We just need to think about that differently. Okay, so sounds like you talked about this a lot last year. Probably lots of you in the room are familiar with that, so I'll just leave that aside then. But the more analytics is a big piece of what we're talking about. So I think it's a very necessary piece of the puzzle, but it's just not sufficient. There's other things going on that we need to worry about as well. And of course, part of this interest in learning health system is this idea that the world is just far more digitized than it used to be. This graph just shows the amount of storage in the world and then the amount of storage that's digital in the world. So really what it shows as much as anything is there's just been like astronomical growth in the kind of information we have at our disposal. But more fundamentally for our purposes, the reason that that information is there is because we have digital storage technologies, which means we have the capability of potentially using that data as well. This always happens on this one little thing. So what's that supposed to show is one of the things that happens because of this digital accumulation of data is that researchers have far greater aspirations than they used to about what they want access to do their research projects. So in what I see in my world running a data center in British Columbia is, yes, of course you want the healthcare services data to look at your population and understand what's going on, but you also might want to add in early childhood indicators or education experience. You might want to add immigration data, things about social determinants of health. So ultimately we're putting broader and broader sets of data together, and that raises some interesting issues. Now, add into that the fact that a lot of what people might want access to is biospecimens, genomic information, other things that are really, we all already understand to be quite, at least potentially identifying. So if you take, we have research projects where there's 15, 16, 17 different data sets coming together, and some of that might be biospecimens, and then we're going to work in a world where we say, oh, but we've de-identified the data. I don't think so. I just don't think that that's really a reasonable thing to be stating anymore. When we have such high-dimensional information about people, we have to treat the data as at least potentially re-identifiable. And more to the point, in the genomics world, there's a potential to identify family members as well as the people who are actually represented in the data. So I'm a researcher. I think this is really important stuff to be doing, but we need to be really conscious that more data and the aspirations of research and the fact that there's so much digital information available just means it's a different world than we used to live in. And the third thing that Kate really touched on a bit already is this idea of more automation. And really from the healthcare perspective, what we're really interested in is how do we use algorithms and other kind of routine processes that depend on data in order to understand what the best treatment pathways might be. So, and this is kind of the quantified self, personalized medicine sort of approach to things. So one of the things we might use genomic information for is to see whether you are the sort of person who's going to respond well to a drug, if you're going to experience side effects, if the drug is going to be effective for you. And there's a million other things you could think about, the development of algorithms to test these things. That's a really, really exciting thing to be able to do in the world of health. But is everybody here who knows the Target story? Right? So lots of you. So algorithms are not benign always, and they don't have to be even designed to be benign. You know, just very quickly for those who don't know, this Target story was about an algorithm developed by Target that ended up identifying a young girl as pregnant before her father knew. So Target knew before the father did that this 15-year-old girl was pregnant. That's a little maybe something we should at least talk about a bit before we kind of go down this road further. Facebook, of course, I'm from Canada, but I'm originally from Michigan, so I feel for you. This whole Facebook thing and the micro-targeting of advertisements during the last election, which was based originally on research done to identify personality types based on how you interact with Facebook. That's a little scary, right? That's, I mean, it's insidious, something we should be talking about. Amazon, there's another story here where they're, what is it called, the selector thing, so the algorithm that says, oh, you bought this book, maybe you'll like this book too. So there's a story about Amazon, oh, if you bought that supply, you might want this one too, and effectively put bomb-making things together to say, if you're buying one thing, maybe you want this other thing. Like, that's maybe we should think twice about that. I don't know, it's such a great idea. So the automation is great. On the one hand, it has lots of promise, but it has some potential pitfalls as well that we should have our eyes open about as we go forward. And fundamentally, I think we just need to recognize that in 2017, we're just not in Kansas anymore. So anybody here from Kansas? So in Canada, when I've said this before, I said that's okay, because I'm not sure Kansas is such a great place. So I don't, but it doesn't matter whether you love Kansas or don't. The fact is that we have gone from this, black and white world, and we've opened the door, and it is like beautiful and glorious out there. But we better get our heads around what's happening, or we're going to end up in a world of trouble. So this is really what we want to do. We want to think about, from an ethical perspective, balancing the public good that can come out of this brave new world, let's just call it that, versus the risks that are there. And sometimes maybe we don't even know what those risks are. And I think the other important thing to think about in a digital age this way is that it is a little bit like Pandora's box. So part of the risk here is there are things that we will not be able to undo once we do them. If your data gets out in the world, it's not going to go away again. It's out there, right? This is what you teach our children, that if you make a post in social media, that's there forever. You might take it down off your site, but if anybody shared it, it's out there. So now the good thing is, if you know the story of Pandora's box, what's left after all the stuff comes out is hope, right? So there's still a possibility to get our heads around this, but we need to do that. And I think another thing to say about balancing risks and rewards, that a lot of times when you think about rewards, they're kind of diffuse. They might affect a whole population. We're trying to improve the healthcare system, so all of us, when we go use the healthcare system, can get benefit from it. So it's a very less tangible, future-looking kind of benefit. The risks, on the other hand, can be borne by particular groups more heavily than others. And this would be if you are an identifiable population with a rare condition or a certain kind of stigmatized disease. So the rewards are diffuse, the risks are not always so diffuse, and that we need to be cognizant of that when we're putting policies together. So here's where I come to where we might go in the future. This is my, when I talk about economics and the difference between technical efficiency and allocative efficiency. And the idea here is that if we are working in a system and just trying to, and I'm going to use the example of individualized consent. We live in a world that is dominated by the idea of individualized consent. And if we just keep trying to make that better and better, we may just completely miss the boat. So what we need to be thinking about is whether, but I hasten to say, I'm not saying that individual consent needs to be thrown out the window. There are absolutely places where it needs to be. I'm just not convinced it's the way we should be going forward in this context of these big data enterprises, learning health system kinds of things, always. I think that part of what I'm thinking about here is I have a colleague who wrote this paper a while ago that was called Pulling Normative Rabbits from Positive Hats. And I feel in some sense that that's what we're in danger of doing. We have a system of informed consent. We're in the process of making it more and more fine-grained and more technically capable so people can opt into this and out of that and into the other thing. But what we're trying to pull out of that very positive technical environment is fundamentally things that really ought to be informed by values and norms at a community level. And part of that is because in the world of automation and algorithms and so on, you will be affected by the algorithms whether you're in the data or not. So the idea that you're going to control what happens to you in this world by controlling your data, I think is a little bit out of date at this point. Okay, so what do we do? What's the possible way forward? One, just we need to accept that we really aren't in Kansas anymore. And the world of the future probably needs different solutions than we used for the world of the past. I think one big thing that we can do here, and this really does relate to that, the work on learning health system ethical framework, is to take a proportionate approach to the way we think about what's allowable and what's not. So let's find the things that are lower risk, that everybody can agree are lower risk, and let them happen, and encourage and incentivize them to happen, and then spend our time talking about and deliberating around the things that seem to be a bit higher risk, where we might not have common agreement about whether it's okay or not in the particular use of data. And I think a big, enormous part of this is actually going and engaging with the public. So because fundamentally we're talking about normative decisions and normative ways of looking at the world, those are value-based kinds of decisions. We can't make them as policymakers. We need to engage the public and get their input into the rules that a diverse group of community can live with. And that's where I'll end it. Thank you very much.
That was really great. And I grabbed my coffee so I can do stupid things faster. So I'm going to take us down a little bit different path because I'm actually not an ethicist. I'm on the technical side of things. And something that wasn't said as part of my bio is when I was at NCI, I was also the Chief Information Officer for the organization. About 8,500 people, and that really did have me think a little differently about risk and what exposure and what data loss meant to an organization. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the take-homes from my talk before I talk, because I think that way then, one, you can tune out, and then two, I'm just going to be supporting really these ideas in my presentation. First thing is, and again, this is now the technical person speaking, not the ethicist or talking about from a legal standpoint, data really need to be liquid. And I'll talk about what that really means. Data sharing itself needs to scale. And Kim was talking a bit about some of the issues around consent, around what I would call high touch, around making data shareable. And to make those things scale, we really do need to understand, well, how does the system itself accommodate that, and how do we make that happen? I know John Wilbanks is going to talk a lot more than I will about this. And in fact, I won't probably talk about it at all. Consent really is a process, and it's we embed things in that process, but really consent itself is something that all of us go through every day in many different contexts. And how do we make that more visible and more appropriate? And then something that I guess I've really lived in the last few years at NCI and now at Duke is, particularly in the area of cancer, but I think it's true in many other diseases, is as we move down the precision medicine road, we're realizing that common disease now really is a collection of rare diseases. And that has lots of interesting implications, both from a data standpoint and then from a care standpoint. My last message at the bottom, in some ways, is I think the most important one, and the whole idea of a learning health system, and frankly the whole direction we're trying to move, is we want to learn from the experience and the presentation of every single patient. And that we can debate and should debate exactly how that happens, but the fact that we really do need, as a society, to learn from everyone and improve for the next presentation of a disease is critical. And I think that's why we're all here. So, again, because I'm really been deeply embedded in the cancer world for a long time, I really do think of cancer as a grand challenge. It's certainly not the only one. But when I was at NCI, I had the opportunity to interact with a lot of different agencies, a lot of different groups, and in particular in the physics community, they think about everything as a grand challenge. And I realized that that's actually a useful framework for thinking about cancer. It is a grand challenge, it requires for us to solve problems in a deep biological understanding, so the really deep research into biological underpinnings of disease. And then there's a whole lot of technical pieces, advances in scientific methods, instrumentation, technology, data computation, mathematical models, predictive models. And I think, again, one of the things that's really coming out is that it's access to data that's really critical in creating learning health systems. And that access to data really helps inform how we need to move forward and the changes we need to make to improve care for patients. And improve not just care for patients, but improve the way that we live so we decrease our risk of getting disease in the first place. So I think we can't lose sight of this whole continuum, that a lot of this is also about making sure people don't get sick in the first place. So just to briefly support my idea that, and it's not my idea, the idea that precision medicine is really making cancer in particular a collection of diseases. You can see, sorry, this is a very small slide. Back in 1996, the way that most people thought about a number of major classes of cancer, so non-small cell lung cancer, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, melanoma, prostate, was effectively as a single disease. By 10 years later, we were realizing, at least in a couple of those diseases, there were a lot of subtypes. And by last year, in fact, all of them had become subtyped, with the exception of prostate. And now prostate it's clear there are multiple classifications, and you can tell that just from the fact that many patients have indolent disease versus aggressive. That's a classification. We don't know how to classify it yet. So what's happening is that, at least in cancer, we're recognizing that we need to be able to aggregate data across a lot more patients just to understand a single subtype. And again, I think that's a really important part of this. From a soapbox standpoint, I think the other thing that was very interesting for me when I was at NIH is to realize that there's really very little work being done on, well, what is health? What does it mean to be healthy? And how do we measure health? Because in fact, if we could do a better job of measuring what health is, I think we could do a much better job predicting when people are going to be sick. So I can share a number of anecdotes, but because I only have 15 minutes, I won't. One of the most interesting ones, though, is looking at early detection in cancer. And if you try to do too much early detection, you really increase the risk to patients. And I can talk about South Korea and their thyroid cancer issues of looking too much for thyroid cancer if we have time for that. The other thing that's really changed in my mind is a recognition, not just in the clinical team, but now in research, how team science is so important. And it's really building up teams of people that work here. And I realized that I did not put in bioethicists into this framework, and I'm very sorry. I should have gone back and edited this. That's bad on me. But really, the idea of having a whole team around every part of the enterprise is incredibly important. The other thing, and Kim already had a slide that is in some ways more eloquent about this than this one is that the scale in which we're doing research and the scale at which we can operate as a society has dramatically changed. So back in 2001, the Human Genome Project finished the first draft sequence of the human genome. That draft sequence cost roughly $100 million, but the project overall at that point in time was about $3 billion. And I like to use that number because there was a lot of technology development that went on to make the Human Genome Project possible. Fast forward 9 years, and NIH was already talking about doing 1,000 genomes for roughly that same $100 million price tag. Then moving in 5 years later, starting the the Precision Medicine Initiative, now All of Us, which is 1 million people. So again, in now less than 5 years, again a tenfold doubling of the number of people that would be participating. And I think, again, one of the challenges is as we start thinking about technology scaling like this, how do we scale the rest of the interactions around healthcare? And it's clear we haven't figured that out yet. One of the things I feel really strongly about, though, is that we do need to have open science. We need to have open data. You see FAIR, and as I think Katie pointed out FAIR, or was it Jody? I'm not sure which one of you it was. She pointed out that FAIR, the acronym findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, it's how the folks that are doing data science can really use the data in hopefully appropriate and informative ways. And at the end of the day, in my mind, it's about how do we also improve, increase, and amplify innovation. So this is a nice little graph. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail from the Harvard Business Review last year in June. And I've found that I didn't used to quote Harvard Business Review in my talks, but now I do. What's really interesting about this is it's talking, there's two axes. One is how complex the data set is, so how rich from a biological standpoint it is, and then how well shared. So sharing is the y-axis and richness is the x-axis. And you can see there's actually very little of our large data sets, our large projects that are both rich and well shared. And one of those is the MMRF COMPASS study that's up in that upper right-hand corner. So that's an interesting problem for all of us. I think that we're all trying to figure out how do we make much more complex data sets more accessible, so again, so we can learn from them, so we can improve care. I'll just, again, re-emphasize that data liquidity, at least to me, is easiest when the data is generated electronically at the beginning. So that means lab data, sequencing data, all these things are essentially digital when they're born. And what I find really frustrating is we ask our clinicians, our care team, the pathologists, the radiologists, to make notes of something that's actually present in the digital data. And then we spend a lot of time annotating and curating those annotations to make sure they really did represent the raw data. I think we're much better off, and again it goes back to friction of data, if we can have those digital forms of data move rather than the annotations move. And in fact, for us to really apply machine learning concepts in healthcare, we really do need to have more access to that underlying raw data, with all the caveats that Kim already mentioned, that our use of it is not always straightforward and has implications that we don't always see at the time. Part of this, though, is also about humans have limited cognitive ability. So this, oops, yeah, wrong button. Ah, yikes. Now I killed it. Rats. I guess I won't use that button again for the rest of my talk. Thank you very much. So the human cognitive capacity, so our ability to make decisions really is a fixed number. We can try to massage the information and make it more consumable for us to make decisions on it, but we're not rapidly evolving like, unfortunately, the digital world is. So we need to help people with this ever-increasing burden of data that helps them make decisions. And that's the way, at least I think about things like machine learning applied to imaging. In this particular case, this is Sebastian Thrun and his colleagues now at Google were able to take machine learning and apply it to photos of patients with potential melanoma, and they could do as good a job as the best trained dermatologist at calling out whether or not that was melanoma. It's not to remove the dermatologist, it's actually so they don't have to look at those pictures. and to have more consistency in the way those digital images are handled. So I'm going to wrap this up and say that I believe now really biology and medicine are data-intensive enterprises. Scale for all of us has rapidly changed. I think that's why we're all here talking about learning health systems, healthcare systems. Technology is everywhere. We can't. That's one of the rabbits that we can't put back in the box. And it's really. And again, I think there's some things here we haven't figured out how to do as a society. How do we leverage the fact that I carry accelerometer and a GPS with me everywhere? Is there somebody that can look at my travel patterns and one say, well, he's a little crazy, but two, he's at risk for getting some disease because look, he's changed his sleep pattern, whatever it is, that it would be useful then to be able to get some kind of information back from these devices to say, you know what, take a day off. I'd actually appreciate that anyway. And then just to reiterate, data liquidity in healthcare is really key for us unlocking a lot of the advantages of having these systems in place. And with that, I will stop.
Do I just use arrows or do I use? Hi guys. I'm Elizabeth Pike. I'm the Director of Privacy Policy at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And so focusing on the theme of systems, I'm going to talk about systems of collection, systems of use, with a focus on biospecimens and genetic material as sort of the case study. I will also begin with the typical disclaimer of federal employees that the opinions expressed in this presentation are my own, don't reflect that of the Department of Health and Human Service or any other government entity. Okay, I'm going to start with the two slides that are my point in full. So again, like Warren said, feel free to stop listening. So the point is this. First, nearly every American has had their genetic material collected and stored in databases for possible subsequent use without their knowledge or consent. Oh, Blue Jeans Network. And two, there are serious consequences, both ethical and legal, for doing this wrong. So let's consider the implications. We're not in Kansas. Let's move forward purposefully. I figured I'd give you a little overview, so if you start to wane, you can sort of pull yourself back and be like, only this much left. First, why do we care about genetics? We've talked a little bit about it before, so I won't touch on it in too much depth. What is the move and the push towards universal inclusion in databases? How do we all get there? How is our information used? What are the justifications for the non-consensual use, and why, in my opinion, do they fall short? And what are some next steps? What should we be thinking about as we realize we're not in Kansas? It's a great metaphor. I'm just going to keep hammering it. Okay, so why genetic material? Here are the three questions we're going to talk about here. Why genetic material? Well, as one of my co-people sitting on the table has told me this morning, he doesn't believe it's the book of life. It's our immortal physical soul. I agree, but there are important things that our genetics tell us about who we are, who we're related to, who we might become. It doesn't tell us everything. We don't even know what it does tell us. We're still in the process of learning. So we do know that there are correlations between our genes, our unique sequence of DNA, and who we are now. Diseases we might get in the future, they're not absolute necessarily, they're not one-to-one, but they're important. Why do we share it? Why do we make these big databases? Because figuring out which variants in our incredibly long string of DNA will result in disease is a really tricky process that requires big collections to have sufficient statistical power to tell us this variant is correlated with this, when you've just got lots of change throughout this string of DNA. So we share it. We need to share it. We need to have these collections to learn, to make medical progress, to make all of our lives better. But what are the consequences of doing this badly. I don't know if this is a common knowledge. You know, you get in the weeds of your own work. But how many people know about the lawsuits in Minnesota and Texas over the newborn blood spots? Okay, a handful. I think it's an important cautionary tale, so I'll just sort of go with the broad contours. But the gist of this is that in every state, and I will talk more about this, but in every state, baby's born, first few minutes of baby's life, heel's pricked, blood's taken, it's collected. It's an important public health intervention, right? We want to know if the baby has something that can be diagnosed early, detected, treated, made better, perfect. Consent isn't obtained, again, because it's a public health intervention, and I think also because of circumstances, like you're in the midst of a new baby, like you don't want to think about what are the parameters. Each state has different rules about how long those cards are kept. In some states, it's up to 21 years. Often they're kept with a whole host of identifiable information, so mother's name, date of birth, hospital in which you were born. And they are a gold mine for researchers, right? It is an unbiased sample of the entire population. You don't worry about selection bias. You don't worry about people opting out in ways that skew your results. So perfect. Most states have very limited third-party uses. So you've got these big collections. You've got very few limits on how they can be used. Awesome, what can go wrong? Until a bunch of parents find out that their kids' genetic material is being used. They weren't asked, they weren't asked to consent, they had no knowledge of this. And in Texas and Minnesota, those parents sued. And the upshot is the court sided with the parents, and both Texas and Minnesota ended up destroying, incinerating their entire collections of this material. Again, we have no way of knowing what hampering effects that will have on medical advances we could have made, but it's not ideal. It's not the ideal outcome for anyone. So let's do it right. I think when we think about universal inclusion in genetic databases, a lot of us might think of the Precision Medicine Initiative, right? This is President Obama's goal of getting 1 million people's data, including genetic, lifestyle, environmental, Fitbit data, a whole bunch of data, medical records, tied together into a sandbox so that researchers can have access, play, learn, make these really important advances. But the actual start of all of us being in databases was much, much earlier. So let's tear the calendar pages off. Let's go back in time. In 1999, RAND Corporation was commissioned to sort of say, how many biospecimens are there? How many have been collected? Where do things stand? And if we're going back to the earlier slide that showed data storage, we're at that sort of inflection point before it started skyrocketing. So this is back in 1999. And what the RAND Corporation found was that there were 307 million samples from 178 million people, which at the time was nearly 2/3 of the population, and that it was growing at a rate of 20 million samples per year. Okay, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a mathematician, I don't do complex equations, but I can do 20 million times the number of years. And where that leads us is to, simple math says it's approximately 600 million samples that have been collected and stored as of today. Again, this is numbers pre the sequencing of the human genome, pre all the technology that allows for easy collection, easy sharing, easy sequencing. So we're in a world where scholars have reasonably concluded that every single one of us is in there. How? How do we get in? Really, there are 4 main ways. So the first is medical waste, right? You go to the doctor, they take a blood sample, they need to run some tests. More often than not, they take more than is strictly needed for the test. And this isn't for nefarious reasons. This is, we might need to retest, we might need to calibrate our machines, like all of that's great. When they're done, they have the option, right? They've got a vial, they've got blood, they could just toss it, hygienically we hope. Or they can say, let's sell it. And that is routinely what is done. Based on RAND Corporation numbers, they concluded that approximately 88% of Americans have medical waste samples stored, collected and stored. And under HIPAA again is what's going to regulate the subsequent use of this material. If they're de-identified, and again, we're going to put de-identified, I think, kind of in air quotes, given what we've talked about the number of databases that are out there, the number of things that are being linked. So if de-identified, per HIPAA, removing the identifier's name, social, birth date, address, there aren't very many limits. And even if identifiable or identified, again, it's still usable. Newborn screening, we already talked a bit about that, but mandated in all 50 states. There's generally no consent for the process. Approximately 4 million samples collected per year, over 100 million samples stored. Again, each state has a patchwork of how they regulate it and what's permitted and what's allowed, but often is retained for years with identifying information, few limits on third-party access and use, and just an incredibly rich data source. It's the entire country in there. The third way, hopefully not we, but possibly any of us could get into these databases is through interaction with the criminal justice system. We have databases in the states and then a federal one that's sort of a little more attenuated. But there are 14 million profiles in these databases. It includes, and again, every state can pick who gets in, so they all have different parameters, but convicted felons, convicted misdemeanors, sometimes merely arrested and you get in a database. Sometimes you're a victim and you get in a database. Sometimes you walked through the crime scene and you're in a database. Sometimes you were excluded as not being someone who's under suspicion. You're in the database. We've seen movies where you deliberately collect the samples, right? Come on in, have some coffee, do stupid things faster. Leave your DNA on the coffee. We're just going to run some tests. Once you're in, it's very hard to get out. So fingers crossed for all of us. And then finally, through online genetic testing. So, right, you know, these companies, you spit, you swab your cheek, you spit in a cup, you submit your material, you receive information about either your ancestry or information about your genetic predispositions. 23andMe has over 2 million users, and the model for most of these companies is actually not making money from the money you pay them. So I pay $100, you give me my information. That's not where the profit lies. The profit lies in collecting large groups of people, I'm gonna move faster, and selling it on the back end. So, okay, what are the uses? Again, 3 main ones: research. Researchers use DNA collected from all of the context. Again, it's governed by the common rule. We think that the ethical protections are informed consent and third-party review. If it's de-identified, there aren't that many protections that are in place. Now we were told that no one cares about these court cases. I do. So in the commercial sector, one of the ideas is, right, like you take my genetic material, you then turn around and profit from it. When people push back and bring lawsuits, the courts have generally been unsympathetic. So we had Morvey Regents where his sort of spleen made good cells that were commercially valuable. In Greenberg versus Miami, we had parents of kids with Canavan who banded together to learn more about it. And the researcher found stuff, made a test that could test for it, patented that test, and then sold the testing at very high dollar amounts. And the parents were like, hey, wait, we did all the work, brought people together. And courts have generally said, no, once it's out of your body, you have no say. Once it's out of your body, your rights evaporate. We don't really want to make informed consent for this because that will chill progress, chill research, so you don't really have much more of a claim. And then, again, the criminal justice system is seeking access to each of the ways that our material has been collected. You can imagine anytime there's a large DNA database and there's a crime with DNA sample, the criminal justice system is going to look for ways to get access. So what are the justifications? Why have these systems sort of gone on where we don't require consent, we don't require third-party review? And there are 3 major ones. The first is abandonment, and this is sort of actually a legal concept, but it's the idea like you've abandoned your genetic material, you disposed of it, you made no provision to get it back. Once it's determined to be legally abandoned, and this is sort of what all the court cases rely on, once it's determined legally to be abandoned, that property can be used for any purpose without permission. So the question I have is whether we can really abandon our genetic material. By law, it requires 2 things. It requires an intent to relinquish and a voluntary effectuation of that intent. So when I think of abandonment, I think of like, I have the sofa, I don't want it, I'm putting it on the curb, I'm putting a sign that says free to anyone. I've met all of those steps. I intend to relinquish it, that's a voluntary decision, I've taken steps to make that happen. I don't think that really applies with your genetic material. I think first, it's still in every cell of your body, so have you really, really abandoned it? I mean, it's still part of you, so Second, like, how many steps can you take to ensure that you don't abandon your cells? There's a voluntariness requirement, and then there's a sense like I can't sweep up every hair I shed, every skin cell I shed. Like, there's traces of DNA in my fingerprints. Like, there's nothing a human can reasonably do to not shed their DNA. Again, de-identification is a primary justification, and I think probably what we'll see over the course of the day is the more data that's out there, the more databases that have our information, the more the things that can be linked to us, the less I think we can realistically talk about de-identification. Sure, my name's removed, but if all of these data points can be correlated with all of these data points and that set has my name, like, it's just a matter of steps. And I also think there are trade-offs. So the more if you remove all the identifiers, if all you're sharing is my genetic sequence with not a single thing more, that's less helpful, right? Like, what you want to know is my medical history. You want to know my lifestyle factors. You want to know the environment I've been exposed to. That's where we get the usefulness. And again, people argue, well, this is just so useful. Like, don't stop it. And the response I have to that is the data show that people are remarkably willing to share their samples when asked. Some people are not. And if we are going to use theirs, despite a small percent of people being unwilling, what we're saying is we don't care. Why don't we just acknowledge people's preferences and go along with that? So, I mean, I don't have much time, but I think the things we really want to think about, we want to think about data security. We want to think that when promises are made to people about how their genetic information is going to be stored and shared and the security of that, I think those promises should be kept to the best of our ability, because this is an area where there's a limited ability of individuals to self-help, right? These are systems in place. One person going up against it, it's just impossible. So we've just got to do better system-wide. I do think, okay, my time is up, but I think informed consent at the point of collection is really important. And I think when possible, third-party review prior to use to just ensure that what we're doing serves society's best interest. Okay. Can read that. I'll leave that up while I'm walking. Thanks, guys.
One thing that several ideologies, for example, patient-centered care, team science, community engagement, learning health systems all have in common are that they encourage and strengthen diversity, collective approaches, learning and understanding, all to strengthen and improve the fields of practice and the discovery process, the science, to eradicate diseases and illness and to support prevention. My mother passed this April from cancer, several kinds. And she was a teacher, traveled the world, 83 years old, was enrolled in a clinical trial and had so many procedures and signed so many consents. But she never really understood. And she always asked, well, why is this happening to me and what did I do wrong? So my question to us all is how can learning health systems support and encourage a platform on understanding, that understanding, that especially for patients and caregivers, that they really know what's going on, and can use that, how can that understanding be used to strengthen the science?
Panelists?
I don't know if my presentation directly speaks, is the one that most directly speaks to it, so I probably shouldn't go in first, but happy to now, and will of course yield the mic. I think there are two pieces to that, right? So patient understanding is paramount, and I absolutely agree that consent forms that are long and detailed and specify every risk and every scientific procedure and are not particularly user-friendly and don't convey the thing that we hope people take away from it. And so there's a lot of literature on what can be done to make that a better process. That's not my particular area of expertise, but I think it's incredibly important. I also think because there are limits to what individuals can do to protect themselves against the risks of all of the swirling systems, I do think we have to make sure our systems are more thoughtfully designed so that it's not all on the individual. I think it's too much for any one individual in the best of circumstances, and a lot of people are coming into research not in the best of circumstances. And so we owe it to them, and we owe it to you know, the ways that they're giving back to protect them in meaningful ways, both through the consent process that's sort of more accessible and through other procedural protections.
So I think you've asked the ultimate multifactorial problems, and that's that there's so many different pieces that both contribute to our ability as individuals to understand what we're presented with and the ways that we actually process it and understand it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing those things, but it means it's really hard to anticipate all the different ways we need to provide patients with information. I think, Kim, you're going to probably bring this up, but one of the advantages in thinking about it from a value standpoint, value for different communities, is that informs how we reach those people, what we need to do to really make sure that they understand what is both expected of them and what we can offer. Looking at it now from a cancer patient's perspective and then a cancer caregiver's perspective, and I'm not an MD, but I've worked with many oncologists over the years, and almost to a person from an oncology standpoint, the question they get asked by their patients is, "Doctor, what's the best thing for me?" And that answer, of course, it's both a very personal thing, and it's a recognition that there's still trust in the patient-provider relationship. And whatever we do from a consent standpoint is, in some ways, and I'll say this very respectfully, less important than that particular interaction. That's not saying it's unimportant, and again, looking at it from a scaling standpoint, we really do need to do a better job of protecting the information that we collect, but that interaction is very personal, and it really is asking the care provider to do the best job for the patient at that point in time. And I don't think that and if it's determined that a clinical trial or a specific therapy is the best, that's something that again, that individual provider, that's their opinion. And again, that's where we want to make sure that there's also a team around both that care provider and the patient. And so again, I think that's something that I've seen is that there's more and more an awareness that most of the care, even a critically ill cancer patient gets, is from their family. And most of the time that patient experiences is with their family. So how do we bring the family into that care setting in an appropriate way without requiring that they sit inside of a primary care facility? So I think these are great questions. I don't have an answer for any of them, I'm afraid, but I can see how incredibly important it is that we figure out again how to make this happen. And I guess my concern is how do we scale this across the whole society, knowing that we really are, at the end of the day, a collection of a lot of different groups, and that we think about some of the same problems in very different perspectives, or from very different perspectives.
So I will add a little bizarre story. Maybe it'll seem tangential. I don't think it is, but there's been a lot of research on costs at the end of life, and it turns out that one of the lower cost areas in the United States is La Crosse, Wisconsin. And if you dig a little bit into why that is, it looks like one of the reasons is that 95% of people who are cared for in the Gunderson Lutheran care system, which covers most of La Crosse as I understand it. This is a few years ago, so maybe things have changed a bit, but 95% of the community had an advance directive in place. Because end-of-life care is one of those funny places where if you actually listen to patient preferences, they tend to choose lower cost care. So it's this alignment of patient preference and the cost interest of the system. And the reason that they had 95% was because they had a community standard about having those conversations prior to the point where they became absolutely necessary. So people had those in place before they ever had a critical care event. So the point of that is that it was very, very normalized in that community to talk about end of life, to make end of life decisions before they became very pointy. And I think if we could aim to do something similar with data use, we'd be a lot further ahead than we are now. So if there was a community understanding of what happened to your data, how it's protected, why the systems work the way they do, what the benefits could be, what risks you might still have in that, then when you get to the point of having a consent conversation, which very often happen in very trying circumstances where some of these things are the furthest thing from your mind because you're dealing with a very intense medical situation, you would be thinking about your consent in the context of already having a pretty good understanding of the way things work. I think we'd be a lot further ahead with that. The other thing I think that your question raises, Karen, is what we do in a learning health system to actually help promote the ideas of patient-centered care. So if we're learning and we understand more about what experiences people are going to have, what they can expect from care, we owe it to patients to be able to provide that information to them in a reasonable format as well. So the learning health system can't just be directed at providers and policymakers. It absolutely has to have a very, very large focus on relaying that information. And the learning health system is a great opportunity to build better decision support systems and care decision aids for patients, and we really need to be doing that.
Great. So I think we're going to open it up to general discussion and questions from the group. So while you're thinking of questions, hopefully you already have many ready to go, but I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask the first one, which I think is probably most responsive to Dr. McGrail's presentation, but I think relevant to all of these, which is to the extent that we say at a social level, so I think you made a proposal that maybe an individual informed consent isn't the right way to go in terms of collecting data, and that we should think about this at a more social level. And so my question is, if we do that, one consequence we might imagine is if people don't think that they have control over their data by giving individual consent to the use of their data in the future, are we going to see upstream consequences in terms of people avoiding seeking care, avoiding seeking certain types of care, avoiding generating certain types of data? We'd seen this in the past, right, when patients would, pre the Affordable Care Act, would forego getting genetic testing because they were worried about insurance repercussions. All of those people who then got genetic testing based on the Affordable Care Act may now be screwed. So is this a kind of behavior that we should be worried about in the future? And if so, how do we avoid kind of causing new problems in terms of people seeking care because we're so excited about getting broad, unbiased data sets?
Yeah. Well, so the flippant answer in part is that if we don't have a high quality healthcare system, then we're not doing people any favor by not having them seek care. So I mean, if we need to have good services that are appropriately defined for people, and so that's it. So. And then I would say on the should side of things, I don't have a policy proposal for what we should do, except that we should talk to the public about what they want us to do. What I think is that, I want to underline, if you are taking a biological sample from somebody, you must have informed consent. I do not want anybody in this room to think that I want to throw that overboard. No way. Of course you have to. The question is what becomes of the information that could be generated from that sample over the longer term. And I think the world of data as it is now suggests that putting a little less emphasis on the consent at the time of collection and more emphasis on consent at the time of use of data for whatever purposes, then we can start thinking about whether that consent for use needs to be individualized or can be a community-based consent to governance for the processes we use to decide about whether something should happen or not happen. But then I go back to what I started with, which is the should here is that those policies need to be informed by community conversations, input from the public, and taking into consideration everything you're raising about the potential for genetic discrimination, employment discrimination, all the other things we need to worry about.
Oh, sorry. Other people might have.
I was just going to add that perhaps the consent process itself could become a bit more fluid in that it's being used throughout the whole continuum of care. And often it's just like at the beginning, you know, when it's needed to sign off, you never really go back to the consent. So maybe it could be used as a document, you know, that sort of supports the different processes or steps that occur during the lifetime of whatever is occurring with patients.
All right, at the risk of stepping in way over my head, I really do think that the consent piece is important, but at the same time, it's really what are we consenting to, and what are the principles behind that we as a society can agree to, and that's really what we want to hold everyone accountable to with the reuse of both the specimens and the data. So I think if we're clear about those principles, we're clear about how people are allowed to interact both with the specimens and the data. Again, I think that the consent becomes one piece of that framework. And again, I think that's something really important. I'm going to call on a colleague of mine, Peter Goodhand, because he's been, for those of you who don't know him, he's been very involved with Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. And I think from a legal standpoint, inside GA for GH, as it's called, there's been a real emphasis on, well, what humans as part of society, we have a right to participate in research and we have a right to benefit from research. And I think that's been a really important, at least for me, thinking about how we think about the use of data and then the use of specimens. So I don't know, Peter, if you have any comments about that, or if I'm putting you on the spot too much since you're not a panelist.
Thank you. One of the reasons I came today is to make sure we keep looking and learning at the other side of the coin, because the Global Alliance, in essence, comes from the heritage of some of those large-scale genomic projects. So Human Genome Project, Thousand Genome, ICGC. So we've come from the world of big genomic research. But increasingly, we see our future, where most of the genomes of the future are going to come from, is from healthcare, not from large-scale research projects. So if we're going to get the right balance of responsible data sharing, we think we've got to make sure that we clearly address this interface that you're all talking about today, the research and these historical divides, and the need, certainly in rare disease, to see research and clinical patient care at the same point. If it's a rare undiagnosed disease, you're doing both at the same time. You have to do research to provide the appropriate diagnosis. So Arthur Knoppers from McGill has really, for the last 3 years, driven our regulatory and ethics work. And when she created our framework with colleagues from around the world, the fundamental base, including John, sitting at the table, the fundamental basis of that framework was the Declaration of Human Rights, and the right of humans to benefit from science, and the right of scientists to benefit from their work. And so this balancing of benefit and risk has been the founding principle of our framework for responsible sharing, but it came from a research perspective. So the reason I and others are trying to get as close as we can to a learning health system, and I reference it in all my presentations, is the sense that the future of genomic research will be closely integrated into healthcare. Whether that's in cancer, where I work most of the time, or in rare disease and other complex diseases, I think we're going to see, we have to address this. So that's why I'm so pleased to be here and listen and learn. I can tell you the large-scale genomic world is very much envisioning a future in which they will have to responsibly work with and across health systems. From a global alliance perspective, when I took Chuck's slide the first time and started to share it with others, I was very, very conscious that the learning health system I look at is the global learning health system. So it's how can Michigan learn from genomic knowledge that's been generated across the world and apply it to patients here? How can knowledge taken here be applied across the world? I think we will look, therefore, at creating things like global knowledge bases, which are searchable, which will be very different from clinical decision systems, which will be deeply embedded within a healthcare system of affordability and reimbursement. So finding this balance is critical. I just share that from. We're absolutely committed to this principle of human rights and the need to create value for human rights.
Thank you, Peter. Sorry to put you on the spot. Really appreciate it.
All right, sir, thanks.
So I was struck by Dr. Pike's presentation of the asymmetry, shall we say, between the research community and the other examples she gave of commercial and security sectors of our economy. I'm curious, it seems to me that what's going on is going to fundamentally lead to a lack of trust on the parts of participants that inappropriately get pulled into these systems without their knowledge, without transparency, without consent. And I'm wondering, you know, I'm not clear that it's directly related to the learning health system and something we can proactively do as part of learning cycles. But I think it's an important thing for us to be doing to correct that lack of symmetry between transparency and consent. And I'm wondering, is that even feasible? When I listen to issues like abandonment, you know, it's clear that the legal system is completely out of touch with the reality and biological knowledge about what a human being is and what are their fundamental processes. And so have we entered into some sort of new age of lack of commitment to human values?
So there's a lot in there, and I was thinking yes, 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 and then we got to the last part about are we in a new age of lack of commitment to human value? And I was like, well, let's think about an answer. So there are a few pieces embedded in there. I think the trust piece is the core, the crux of it, right? The fundamental piece. My sense, and I don't have empirical data to bear this out, so this is just a gut level thing, is that once people lose trust in things, there is the possibility for those systems to grind to a halt, right? Once people no longer trust that things will be used properly, safeguarded, once people start to worry about that, some segment won't care, right? But some segment will opt out. And so I think that building trust into systems is fundamental. I think it's both the right thing to do legally and ethically, and I think it's the right thing to do in terms of getting to good outcomes. So trust, yes. The legal system. So what's so interesting is the law has these like distinct categories through which they adjudicate problems, like property law, contract law. And I think when things like biospecimens enter the picture, the lenses through which the law views them just don't quite make sense. So when they think about who has the property right in this, and they say, you know, property is a bundle of sticks and who gets different sticks, and like, it doesn't properly account for things like data that can be shared, distributed, doesn't sort of diminish with each sharing, can be used to create value in different ways. I mean, there's so many lenses through which you can see that problem. I don't even mean to say a problem, but you can think through, and whether ownership is the proper structure, the law just doesn't have the vocabulary to address it. So I think, you know, scholars in law are thinking through this. I'm trying to think through some of this. It's hard, it's complex. And the science is moving, the technology is moving, so legal scholarship tries to chase along behind, and then you've got the courts following along way after that. So yeah, I think the law gets it wrong a lot of the time, particularly in decided cases. And sometimes I think when the law sort of reaches the decision that the law has to make, those are the laws, that's what the facts in front of them lead a judge to decide, and we get the sense that it's ethically wrong. I think sometimes those are warning bells to us that we need to think about that's some place to sort of investigate what the law says has to be, and does it have to be that? I might pass on the last question about lack of caring, because I feel like this climate makes me think no one cares about anyone. Not this climate.
So I do think that trust piece is really important, and we see in society, and this does impact me in some, really actually all of us in some fundamental ways. When that trust erodes and there isn't, in fact, the education in the populace that we need, we see crazy things like anti-vaxxers. Okay, so I'll say hopefully there's nobody an anti-vaxxer in here, but it's very clear that when people do not give their kids HPV vaccination when they hit 11, 12 years old, that impacts all of us because it decreases the ability of that vaccine to really affect HPV. So for those who don't know HPV, the human papillomavirus, it is a source of every single case of cervical cancer. It's an increasing number of cases of various oral cancers, and it can be eradicated if everyone got the vaccine. But again, there's a misperception, a lack of trust that they're being told the truth by the medical establishment in a growing part of the U.S. population. So again, how do we stop that kind of erosion of trust and make sure people, when they're told this is really good for you both as an individual and as a society, how do we make sure we haven't undermined that trust somehow? So these are critical questions in my view.
No?
We're hard to see over here.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
So I kind of wanted to crack open the education piece a little bit, and I would agree that it's, when do you want to do education? How do you formalize the respect for the education through consent that occurs? So Melissa Gillian, University of Chicago, developed a really lovely patient app where right before they would go in, they would get an educational intervention on different levels of the effective methods for birth control and what is a more or less effective method of birth control. That would, by the time they went into the clinical visit, they were a more informed patient, and they obviously transitioned over more to selecting more effective methods of birth control and having fewer unintended pregnancies. On the flip side, I don't think we can just wait until there's consent to use, right? You can't go 20 years back in time and say, well, we're going to use your sample now, we need to go get your consent if you can find someone. I think that's too late in the game. And some folks at the American Medical Informatics Association last week just presented from University of Florida and Indiana University that people actually just were happy, oftentimes when given a scenario, to give a broad consent, but they just wanted to know when their data was going to be used. They just wanted to report back about when and why their data was used. So I'm sort of wondering if we can figure out a time when to give appropriate user-centered educational consent for a number of uses, and how would we get institutions to agree that that's an appropriate way to handle consent? Because even if you go to an IRB, the same institution, and the IRB panel changes, you're going to get a different interpretation of the protocol, clinical or research. So when do we do that, and how do we all get to a point where we can respect that education? Because I don't think we're going to see education about data and biospecimens in the public education, in public schools. We're not going to see that. In the media, that's not a convincing, there's no PSA or billboard scheme that's going to, educate the public on that.
Okay, I guess I'll wander in where fools wander in where angels fear to tread. So I'm going to wear a little different hat when I answer that question. That's when I look at this from a data science and visualization piece and try to get people to use an interface, a piece of software. You really want to give them back something for providing their information. So I had the opportunity to work with a GERD clinic. So GERD's often viewed as a precursor to having esophageal cancer. And for patients going under a different proton pump inhibitor, that the clinic wanted to understand, well, which proton pump inhibitor worked best and can we predict better? So we built a little app. This is now 10 years ago, so it seems like it was really innovative at the time, but now we're all doing. And we asked the patients to put in a little diary of how they felt and what their symptoms were like after they started the inhibitor. And part of that app was when they got to the end of 5 screens, we gave them a graph of the scores they used, every score they had entered, and then how patients on the different inhibitors overall were doing. And then we also gave them a flag that you're doing better or you're doing worse, and just a little just if you will, an attaboy, or talk to your provider if you're doing worse. And we intended that everyone would take that once a week. What was really fascinating is almost after the second or third time, so the second or third week, everyone went to daily because they wanted the feedback. And again, I think that's something that as we're thinking about every touch that we have with a patient, every touch we have in the society is an opportunity to educate and give people back information for what they're providing to us. And again, I don't think we often close that loop, and we don't spend enough time thinking about, well, where are those opportunities for giving something useful back for people for participating in research. So I thought it was really interesting when all of us was first being conceived. I had the opportunity to sit at one of those early meetings, and I said, okay, well, I think as an individual, if through all of us, I could coalesce and have a dashboard of every one of my providers, that is worth all kinds of effort for me to participate in all of us. So right now that I don't think that dashboard exists yet, but I'm really looking forward to having that dashboard. And John, you're probably in the middle of that dashboard. So again, I think it's defining and designing the systems that really give us opportunities to reach back in informative ways to patients at every point in their lives, when they're not patients, and when we're all parts of the public too. So I think I believe there's a piece for formality and how do we get that formal education, but it's also how do we redesign everything that we're doing to make sure that we view everything as an opportunity and capitalize on those opportunities to really, again, bring all of us along.
And I'll add, wouldn't it be wonderful if at some point, that these systems were able to work with communities and advocates and others so that, we all have or are exposed to individuals who are not able to really understand or comprehend for various reasons, and so, but yet they're still being treated often as loners, without any support, and we know it. And so, wouldn't it be fantastic if there were ways that these partnerships could form to strengthen, especially targeting those individuals who don't have that support or systems in place, and that could be even operated through the health systems and, the healthcare industry itself to partner with others. So they could employ people, they could, community organizations, that's what we do. But, it's only those individuals who seek it out. Often. So, I'm just suggesting that, our researchers and investigators and doctors and, healthcare folks, that they themselves begin to take that extra step, to make sure people really understand it and to support some sort of a matchmaking for those who don't.
I would just underline what Karen said, and just to, how I think you all know how I feel about this point about the importance of talking with community, but hand in hand with that is transparency. So whatever decisions are made, whatever system of governance to data access is in place, however we're going to run the system, we need to be really, really willing to talk about what that is and what it means, and to be willing to say something about the risks that still remain in the system, as well as the public good benefits that can come out of it. There's just really no substitute for being open and willing, and as Karen said, perhaps in combination with actually doing actual outreach, doing some push of that information, not just letting people pull it when they want it.
And I guess, to the point of when informed consent or when education. So, I mean, I think my baseline premise is education always, often, early. Let's get people scientifically literate. Let's get, you know, everyone believing in facts and data. And I think that's an important first step. But then when it comes to specifics, I believe that consent should not be in the sort of the thick of a medical emergency. I mean, sometimes you can predict it and sometimes you can't. I know there's a community of people who say, like, we can never get consent for newborn screening because, you know, baby's born, you've got a screaming baby, you've got new parents, and it's very stressful, and there's a lot going on, and this is the last thing on people's mind, and I absolutely agree, but there are a lot of prenatal visits that come before baby being born, where you can have conversations, where you can do some of the education. I just think it's about being thoughtful about when do you give people information so that they have the tools in their tool chest to make choices at times where it's not high stakes or high stress. And I think you can't always find those spaces, but I think a lot of times you can, and I think maybe it involves sort of more rigorous health system structure in place where people have regular doctor visits, or maybe, I don't know what it is in every circumstance, but I do think often there are ways to do a meaningful consent process outside the times we think of doing the consent process.
All right, so we have time for one question or possibly two if they're particularly quick. So.
I don't know if it's necessarily a question. I was really interested in what you said about what is health. And we talked about trust as the crux. I kind of disagree with that. I think what is health, what is our value, and if we can start affecting culture and society, underneath our, we're all so creative, we can create these systems, but do they really match what our values are and what we believe, and how do we want to be living? The trust with your mother saying, where did I go wrong? And you have the app, well, contact your provider. Does that provider even know what to do with that contact? When we can start to look at, or to realize that we all are really connected. We all are here on this globe, on the blue spinning ball, and when we can start to have similar values, I think the questions that we are struggling with today will naturally be answered, because what we're wanting as a community, as a society, as a community, in a relationship, whether it's a provider or an ethics board with a researcher or a patient with their doctor, colleagues, we all want that. What is health? Where do we? What is that basis there? And so how can we affect that into the system? Because trust will be created out of that. There is trust. Trust gets diminished, but I think we're all naturally wanting to trust, and we learn not to trust. So how can we affect and put those values in initially into all our algorithms, all the AI that's not going away? We're not going back in the past. That's there. So how do we, as a society, work out of that perspective?
Do you want to do it first?
Well, so I think those are great points, and I didn't mean necessarily to connect them all the way that you've connected them, but I think that's a really valid way to think about it. But I do think that as we grow up as individuals, we absolutely learn to start questioning things, and that's not necessarily bad, and part of that questioning is trying to evaluate, well, who can I trust? But I think that the flip side is, and we haven't really talked about this yet, and that's really what are the incentives in the system to be able to encourage both education and provide high trust to individuals. So one of the things that I guess I was involved with, which the results of this were a bit surprising to me, but looking backward, it's pretty obvious. So how many of you are involved in part of the CARE enterprise somewhere? So, okay, so a few of you. So what you may know is that coming up very soon, organizations will be either rewarded or fined, depending on the way you think about it, for readmissions and readmission rates of patients. So a number of different organizations that I'm connected to have been looking at what's the number one reason for patients being readmitted. And the answer to that is really twofold. One is their ability to understand the materials they're given at discharge, and then two, who picks them up. And those two things turn out to be really important. And they're related because it's about, well, who is prepared at the point of discharge to understand, well, how do you care for that patient so they don't end up back in the hospital? And so I think that's a really interesting incentive now to be able to reach back and actually pay for education for patients and their families. So again, I tend to be, I guess I'm still very optimistic that we will get this right, but sometimes the levers that help us get it right aren't actually what they were designed to do at all. So I think that's something, again, we want to be really thoughtful of, is which levers are we asking to either turn on, turn up, turn down, and what, from a system standpoint, what will that do for us, particularly looking at a learning healthcare system. And I think actually the interesting part about worrying about readmission rates is that may be a lever for patient education that none of us perceived.
And I guess one of the pieces in your question that I'd maybe push back on is the idea that we all have shared values. I don't think that's true, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think, I've done this presentation in other communities, and people say, I don't care about my privacy, have it all. And I've had people say, oh my God, how can I protect against my stuff being collected? And neither of those are bad responses. Those are just a range of responses. People feel, have a range of risk tolerance. They have a range of privacy concerns. I think that's fine, and I think that's right, and I think that's just how it is, so I don't know, I wouldn't fight against it even if I could. But I think that's where the trust piece comes into play. I think when people are put in relationships with each other where their incentives differ as well, you just want to know who's asking for what, why they're asking for it, to see if their reasons for using it align with your willingness to give. And so I think designing all of that into the algorithms, designing all of that into systems is important, but I think healthy skepticism is important too. Like I want to ask some questions. I want to make sure that I'm being given an accurate picture. And I think that's where the education, and I think that's where so many of these pieces tie together, just to make sure that people are making decisions with correct information and making decisions that align with their value. And I guess one of the things I would, and I don't know how to effectuate this, but one of the things I'm sort of puzzling through now is how to allow people to sort of put in place a consent process, whether or not we think that's all or even important, but to not sort of say, okay, but if you don't get it. I think we have a tech world that's booming up around us. They offer terms of services, and in some ways that's considered the consent, right? You click the box, you've access, you've accepted. But there isn't really an alternative. There isn't a meaningful way to say, no, but I want pieces of this, and I want these portions, but it's either it's a full package or not. And if you opt out, if you try to take yourself out of the digital world, it's just, it is exactly, all of your data interactions are being tracked, and there's not an easy way to opt out of that. And so that's kind of one of the things I'd like to push on, and I have no answers, and I'm at the very beginning of thinking of it, but I think that's a piece of this as well.
So very quickly, I'll just add, I was going to say the same thing as Lizzie, is we don't all have the same values, and that's what makes us a really, really interesting society. And I think maybe what I'm encouraging as much as anything is that we shift our focus not entirely away from, but to include not just the one-on-one trust-building interactions and so on, but actually create those interactions at a community level, or at least in broader groups as much as we can. Because it's only, and this is, I'm going to say this based on many conversations with my colleague Mike Burgess without giving him responsibility for me butchering what thinking is here, but I think the challenge for us is to find a way to set rules for how we're going to operate in this new data environment we're in that are okay with everybody, given that we have different values. That is not an impossible task, but it is one that will take some time and effort, and it's one that cannot come from top down. It has to come from bottom up, and it has to come from people with different values being able to have a conversation with each other and work that out.
I'll just briefly add that I was intrigued by both your question and the gentleman's here in the blue shirt on the ethics. And so what it really is encouraging systems that both support and encourage a culture and almost a social responsibility, and that means different things to different people, but that people understand. So